Today in the EU, what the Union stands to lose from Trump's return.
The golden age of America begins right now.
The second Trump term has officially begun. Today, the 47th President of the United States will sign up to 100 executive orders, including on climate, trade, and security. In the meantime, the EU remains a headless bloc. Member states like France, Germany, and Austria are busy putting out political fires at home. So what did Trump promise in his first address to the nation? And how will Europe be affected by it? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU.
Do you go on
What
settings,
if I
maybe?
go mirror displays, and then, I want to settings.
I think to go on settings and then sound.
But 1 second, what if I do this? Oh!
There we go. Right on
Okay.
time.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, the Honorable Donald John Trump.
It's 7 p.m. at the Eurectives offices in Brussels. Our team, the podcast team, has just finished watching Trump's first speech to the nation as president-elect. I'm calling in Peter Rao, director of the Center on Europe at the Hudson Institute, who's following from D.C. to get some first reactions. Hi, Peter, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
So President Trump's inauguration speech just finished. It was a bit less than an hour, and in it, the president-elect condensed a long series of intentions regarding what his legacy will look like, from renaming the Gulf of Mexico Gulf of America to revoking the Green New Deal, invoking a national emergency at the southern border. What's your first reaction to all this?
My first reaction as a foreign policy professional is that it was overwhelmingly a speech focused on social issues, domestic politics, repudiating the woke agenda, and really sketching out many of the themes which he had campaigned on and pouring them into policy proposals. We've now seen in the minutes after the president's speech, the first press statement go out from the new Trump White House. And as was signaled in the day leading up or the days leading up to the inauguration, the first executive orders will be coming soon on topics like energy policy. And so it was an unsurprising speech. I thought it was actually a rather optimistic and hopeful speech, and he really struck a chord about where America had been and where it might go. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it was unusual because Trump really stuck to the teleprompter for the speech.
Yes, indeed, he was unusually fluent, I have to say, and coherent in his speech. Anyways, he did cruise through some of his classic themes: immigration, security, freedom. And here in Brussels, we were carefully watching to pick up any hints where he sees the transatlantic relation heading. But Europe was not a part of the address. How do you interpret it?
I think there were probably two parts of most importance to Europe. The first is the reference to peacemaking. You immediately follow that with the discussion on the hostage deal that came out of the Middle East and some of the additional negotiations that will take place in the Middle East. But there's also a flavor there that applies to Europe because, of course, he's intent on forging some sort of ceasefire, eventually peace deal when it pertains to the war in Ukraine. And then the second was the announcement that he intends to extract revenues from trade via tariffs. That's a theme of his that we know going back months and years.
Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens. For this purpose, we are establishing the External Revenue Service to collect all tariffs, duties, and revenues. It will be massive amounts of money pouring into our treasury coming from foreign sources.
But the details themselves were not yet offered. So this really was a broad thematic speech, and then we'll see where exactly it comes down on tariff rates and tariff schedules as the administration rolls out new policy.
Indeed, on defense, he mentioned he will act as a peacemaker and a unifier. But at the same time, Trump complained that the United States has spent unlimited funding on the protection of foreign borders. Isn't there a dichotomy here, or how can we interpret the speech?
Well, I think he really wanted to strike a message of unity when it comes to Americans and American citizens and bringing this country together. He took a passage aimed directly at minorities who voted for him. He spoke about past presidents and how he intends to lead the country into a golden age of unity going forward. As to the world writ large, I think he's less focused on unity and put more of an emphasis on respect. So Trump, the hardliner, Trump, the man who projects American power in order to exact concessions and extract concessions abroad. I wouldn't say that unity is necessarily where he wants to go. And this is probably a difference between Democrats and Republicans writ large in Washington. Democrats tend to try to find unity, meaning lowest common denominator at times, policymaking with our allies, especially the Europeans. Whereas I think Republicans, at their best, are more likely to set out bold positions and then create a slipstream behind which the allies can assemble. Trump will be much more of the latter than the former.
And relating to your second point, the one on trade and tariffs, one of these executive orders that will be issued in the next 24 hours deals with the setup of an external revenue service that will collect tariffs, taxes, and duties. Do you think this could impact the EU, and how?
I don't think it will impact the EU in the sense that we're already collecting tariffs, and this just creates a different mechanism. It does mean that Trump will spotlight the tariff collection more, and that he will want certain monies collected via tariffs. But the $1 million or the billions of dollars question is, what is the tariff schedule going to look like, and who will it be applied against? And there we've seen a lot of different rhetoric and different proposals floated in the media, rolled out by President Trump on campaign speeches. And I don't think, perhaps the administration has landed on an answer, but if so, it hasn't been made public yet. So it could very much so affect the EU. Or it could be the opening bid in a negotiation with the Europeans to get concessions on other issues. It's hard to say.
And Trump said he will revoke, through an executive order, the Green New Deal and will boost car production.
With my actions today, we will end the Green New Deal and we will revoke the electric vehicle mandate, saving our auto industry and keeping my sacred pledge to our great American auto workers.
That could potentially impact, by far, the global level of CO2 emissions.
I think that's embedded in a broader debate in the U.S. between energy independence and energy production people or supporters on the one hand, and on the other hand, climate change, climate protectionists, regulators who want to have a much more invasive kind of approach to the American economy. Trump clearly falls in the former category. That first press release I mentioned earlier already talks about revocation of Paris climate change agreement. So the Americans pulling out of that, which he can do by executive order since it was never ratified through the Senate. It'll mean unleashing American energy. So as he said, drill, baby, drill, and on public lands as a way of trying to open up American energy. And it could mean a couple of things. Number one, Europe, which is trying to wean itself off of Russian hydrocarbons, could be a beneficiary of this. It could also strike a stake into the heart of Vladimir Putin's budget, which is dependent on high energy prices. And it will mean that America becomes less dependent on pressure from adversaries abroad. Those are all, I think, positive things that one could expect from it, including, for example, mineral extraction and mining when it comes to rare earths. The Chinese are cutting off American gallium, which is important for semiconductors. The Europeans have felt that for some time as well, even longer than the U.S. And on the other hand, there'll be those who argue that innovation and market incentives aren't enough, that you have to directly reach into the economy to force a greenifying agenda. And that's just where I think President Trump and some of the progressives in the U.S. have an ideological difference.
Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yesterday, Trump promised his election will be the most consequential in the history of the United States. Hard to say how consequential it will be for Europe. To have a better understanding of how the bloc has prepared for Trump's return, I'm talking to Jeremy Shapiro, the research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hello, Jeremy, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, here at Euractiv, we've been polling the mood across European capitals, and it seems that something has changed in terms of perspectives from Trump's first term. Europeans seem to be coming to term with him. They seem more detached in a way. How do you read this? What's your take?
I don't know, that might be a little bit of a misremembering of 2017, to be honest with you. One of the things I noticed in 2017 was that there was, during the election, a huge amount of panic about what Trump would do.
Yeah.
And the day after the election in November 2016, everybody became very practical because they sort of said, okay, we have to deal with Trump. And they've done that again. They avoided most of the panic in the first round beforehand because they always believed that he could be elected this time. So they were more careful. And now after the election, everybody is being even more pragmatic than they were in 2017. And I think that the reason for that is the level of dependence of Europe on the United States has increased fairly dramatically in the last 8 years. And so there are fewer and fewer options to be critical of an American president.
Are you referring to defense and energy?
Defense, energy, even on the economic side. Yeah. I mean, the trajectory over the last, I would say actually over the last 15 years, but particularly since the Ukraine war began, is for greater and greater dependence of Europe on the United States. Before the Ukraine war, what people used to say is that, they were usually referring to Germany, that Germany was dependent on Russia for its energy, America for its defense, and China for its markets. Increasingly, Europe is dependent on the United States for all three. And so that has vastly increased the dependence.
And on that, Trump said he would increase America's energy exports.
And we have something that no other manufacturing nation will ever have, the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we are going to use it. We will bring prices down, fill our strategic reserves up again, right to the top, and export American energy all over the world.
You wrote that 2025 would look like, and I'm quoting, Trump's world, where Europe's response to the election would be one of preemptive surrender. Are our hands really that tied?
Yes, fundamentally. And I think I perhaps exaggerated a little bit. Obviously, the Europeans still have agency. They still have assets to offer. They still have capacities to be part of the negotiations, particularly if they can create more unified positions. But I think that their circumstances are much worse than they were in 2017 on all of those fronts. And it does mean that it's going to be a lot more difficult, that unity, always elusive in Europe, is going to be even more of a requirement. And so I'm not super optimistic, but I think, to be fair, it will vary from issue to issue, and they will have some capacities to realize their interests with the Trump administration.
Focusing for a second on security, one of those subjects where Europe is working towards a more cohesive stance. So do you think that Trump 2.0 will be different from his previous presidency when it comes to security? And what do you make of Brussels' preparation to the expected changes?
On the sort of broader European security questions, I think it isn't as different during his first term, but I think that Europeans are once again falling into this Trumpian trap of imagining that if they do the things that he says, that he will be a good ally and satisfied. So you can see Europeans just constantly coming forward and saying, well, we're spending the 2%. We're spending the 2%. Trump's reaction, very, very predictably, is that he's just upping the number.
Yeah.
Because the point from Trump's perspective is not to get Europeans to hit some sort of target. The point is to use their failure to provide for their own defense as leverage in broader negotiations, particularly on trade issues, and to force them to take greater responsibility for European security so that he doesn't have to spend money and effort on it. And I think that that is not different than the first term, but it will be a little bit more intense and a little bit more coherent in the second term.
And I'm thinking specifically of Marco Rubio, Trump's pick for Secretary of State. Where does he stand on this? As a senator, he did vote against the, 2024 bill that sent millions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine. So do you think there will be any sort of pushback internally?
If you're asking where does Marco Rubio really stand on this issue, if you look back over his career, he's been a very classic Republican neoconservative, very supportive of U.S. leadership in the world, an acolyte early in his Senate career of John McCain. He would ordinarily be, and probably is, very supportive of a strong hawkish position toward Russia and a lot of support of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at what's happened to him in the last, I'm not sure, 3 or 4 years, you would have a lot of difficulty finding any distance between him and Trump on any issue. And he has, I think, mastered the technique of demonstrating loyalty to Trump to such an extent that he was able to execute the very rare accomplishment of getting back into Trump's good graces.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone in the Trump orbit is still quite suspicious of his loyalty and ideology. So I don't think that you will see him straying at all. So if you want to ask where Marco Rubio stands, you should ask the question that Marco Rubio is probably asking himself. Where does Trump stand?
The other hot topic, as I mentioned before, is trade and tariffs. We're recording this interview right before the speech and the beginning of a mandate that could lead to an escalation that could look like a trade war. Is the EU prepared for it?
I get the impression that the EU is reasonably prepared. I think that is a pretty substantial difference between now and 2017. On the trade front, Trump has been very clear about what he was going to do. The EU has been very aware that he could be the president, and they've been preparing both carrots and sticks.
Right.
The carrots are mostly more LNG purchases and other purchases. The sticks are a bunch of targeted retaliatory tariffs. I think they have a couple of problems leading into this, even though they are reasonably well prepared and reasonably well united on this file.
How so?
I would guess first, it's that they've badly sequenced, I should say, their carrot and their sticks. With Trump, what you want to do is lead with the sticks and then come in toward the end with the carrots. That's what he does. And they've done the opposite. So they basically said, well, we could buy more LNG, and they haven't really talked up their retaliatory tariffs. They're preparing them in quiet in the background. And the reason that that's worked that way is because it's a lot easier for them in dealing with their member states to offer positive things to the U.S. And it's very politically controversial in Europe to take confrontational public stances against the U.S. still. The second bigger problem, perhaps, is that the EU is prepared for a negotiation which is limited to trade and economic issues. And I don't think that the Trump administration will do that. They've been signaling in any number of ways that the American security commitment to Europe is dependent upon a better deal for the United States on trade, however the United States defines that. And the Europeans are not prepared to bring those issues into the negotiation because the European Commission, the European Union, doesn't have competence on those issues and has to refer to the member states.
Right.
That creates a much weaker negotiating position for the Europeans. And they are aware of this, to be fair, but it's just the structure of the EU and its relationship to its member states makes it very, very difficult to deal with that.
Speaking of the negotiation table, it seems that Giorgia Meloni might be sitting at the head of it as spokesperson of the Europeans. After all, she's the only leader who's been directly invited to the inauguration speech. Do you think Meloni would be fit to lead negotiations on behalf of Brussels? And could that give Brussels any sort of leverage?
I think that Meloni is a pretty good interlocutor. It's true that I think Trump and a lot of other Republicans like her. She does seem to be very, very effective at charming old men. And I guess that can be of modest use. But there is this sort of idea in Europe, not just in Europe, but in a lot of the world, that if you just find somebody that Trump likes, you'll get a better deal.
Yeah.
And it's a good idea to find somebody that Trump likes, like in any negotiation, of course. But I don't think it has a big impact on the outcome of any of this stuff. There was an old saying that developed in his first term. If you're in a room with Trump and you're not sure who the Chris Christie is, you are the Chris Christie. Chris Christie was this guy who did everything he possibly could to defend Trump and still got pissed on in a deeply humiliating fashion.
Right.
And eventually determined that he might as well own his truth and be opposed to Trump because there was no point in being supportive of him. You got nothing from it. Meloni can definitely have a good meeting with Trump. She can definitely come out and have a good news conference with him, but I don't know what good it will actually do her or Europe.
Well, that's quite a gloomy picture you're painting, Jeremy, I have to say.
Yeah, sorry. I guess my bias is very clear. In 2017, it was a little bit less clear who he was, but now we know who he is. And he's not very interested in geopolitics. He's not very interested in U.S. allies. He's entirely interested in his own political, financial standing. And we have to deal with that on that level. I think the other thing that's happened in the interim is that the presidency has, continuing a trend, become ever more powerful, particularly in foreign affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the United States isn't all powerful. Trump isn't all powerful. Within the United States, there are ways of working the seams of this problem that can make it better. And I'm not predicting that there's going to be a total breakdown in the transatlantic alliance, but I think people should enter into this very clear on who Trump is and what he wants.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.